I've been laureate for Irish fiction under the auspices of the Arts Council, about 2022, 23, and 24. And I'm coming to the end of my term as laureate for Irish fiction. I think I wanted to connect with readers, but just make sure that the idea of reading itself could be elevated slightly, at least, to be a sort of art form. In other words, that there's no book that does anything at all unless there's a reader. So once you have that dynamic between book and reader, then you can make it further between writer and reader. And so the idea was to just connect as much as possible the writer and the reader. I think in Ireland, one of the things we have to be proud of is the way the libraries have functioned in towns, especially in rural places, but also in Dublin and Cork, where we have dedicated librarians. We have local authorities who are dedicated to the idea of maintaining the library system. We have government even maintaining. So it's one thing we all agree on, that the going to the library on a Saturday or a Friday when you're 5 is important. But what they've done in recent years is to reach out and create a body of readers who come to the library not just to borrow books now, but to actually use the building and to go to events and to create a sort of community of readers. So that's something that actually is already there in Ireland. So I think it would be a big mistake not to use it or tap into it, or in some ways just connect that idea of this public space with the private business of reading and the private business of writing. So therefore we were lucky to be able to partner with them and to use the public libraries so that all the events we did were in libraries and were run by librarians. And so that it wasn't just we were arriving in a town, that the librarians had requested a certain writer and we were lucky if we could facilitate. And so that was the first idea. And I suppose the second one then was to find the writers and make sure that when we were doing the event, that, that one book was being dealt with, rather than asking vague questions about, were you always a writer? Was your uncle a writer? Was to do specifically to talk about the writing of a specific book, which the audience in the library would already have read. Now, this is important, oddly enough, because writers are so much involved now in commercial activity, where you're doing a reading tour, but it's basically to sell books. Now, okay, you manage to reach readers, you do all the other things, but you're on a commercial tour, basically. But this idea of getting that out of the way, so it's not as though you're selling books. The books have already, as it were, been read by the reader. You're connecting with people who've already read your book. So it is much more, I suppose, you're not selling anything. And I think the audience is aware of that you're not just trying to hype your book up, that the writers were seriously trying to engage, and so were the audience about what it means to read and what it means to write. I mean, I think what we're involved in is an idea of public space. And one of the things that is a public space, as well as the library building, is the internet itself. And so the idea of just being able to put all the events online and to make them free of charge and to edit them in a way that would make them sort of engaging for someone watching the internet, and to leave them there for a while, so that, I mean, over the 3 years, we have more than 30 of them, which are, I suppose, a record for the future, perhaps an archival record, but for the moment, it is an effort to capture. And what's interesting is that it isn't as though we did everything, because, in 3 more years, you could find another 30 writers whose books would have some way moved people enough for people to come to the event or read the book. So it isn't comprehensive. It's very important that there are many other writers we could equally have used. I think we learned something along the way, which we probably knew but didn't know well enough, which is that you can never say that a certain book is not for everybody. That idea that Ulysses, that's not true, actually. There's a way into Joyce's book for anyone, even who has read even genre fiction that's not literary fiction before. And so too, there was a really funny moment in Granard where it was done on Zoom, and it was with the writer Philip O'Callaghan. And Philip O'Callaghan lives in Bucharest. And Bucharest has really mattered to him because he's become, I think, a Central European writer in the tradition of Kafka, say. In other words, he's writing about the dark, haunted male figure facing into an uncertain existential future. And someone could say, why would you do that in Granard, in the public library? It's not a university audience. It's not an audience of people listening to Morrissey. It's very much what we might call the ordinary reader. And what we learned about the ordinary reader was there was no challenge involved. You simply read the book. And when faced with Philip O'Kelly, the author of the book, they asked him many, many questions. And there was a sort of ease between him and them, or between his book and them. And this was lunchtime. I think it was a Saturday. People had wandered into the library. People had already read the book. And there was a sense of ease and engagement with his character, with the sort of... I mean, some of these stories are wonderfully weird. I mean, they're just great. And the people of Granard had no difficulty with wonderfully weird, with literary fiction that's wonderfully weird. And that's exciting because of its strangeness. And that was a lesson to us, meaning don't ever patronize a group of readers. Don't ever think that something is not right for a reader because it might be too difficult, too strange, too weird. Because you would get that so wrong if you started to feel that. There was really another occasion which was absolutely extraordinary, which was going to Donegal with Paul Lynch. And he wanted to go there, and then we found that was a library wanted to have him. Here he was back in his childhood place, having written this novel, which really is a very frightening book, because it's so well done, the idea that democracy has failed in a very specific Dublin. People are being taken in and held, and no one can find anybody, and they're sort of militia in the streets. And he came up with, you know, there was no trepidation on our side. I mean, this was a book for everybody. And people in the library came in, and there was one woman who began to engage with him about how she felt about the character, and she was absolutely taken over by the book. And outside was that huge Donegal sky on the verge of twilight, you know, and we were in this, again, some of the libraries, the modern libraries, I mean the modern buildings are really Kinsale. The library there was a revelation. The library in Wexford, I mean, those are beautiful buildings now. In the future, when people are talking about, you know, a great golden period of architecture, the public libraries are doing pretty well in this. And that evening with Paul Lynch was pretty special because, you know, he'd won the Booker Prize. His book was now being translated into every language. But here he was in the place where he went to school, where he was brought up, where his father worked. And actually, it wasn't as though he was coming in as a stranger. He wasn't a stranger, not only because he'd been brought up there, but because his book made him. People found something in the book that excited them, but that it was a sort of familiarity with the world, and that it's not hard to be frightened. Every month I did a blog, and I discovered something about a blog that no one has ever made a rule about how long a blog should be. So I began by saying, well, a blog is usually about 800 words, 600 words. You know, a blog is just a thought you have, and then you develop it a bit, and then you stop. It's like a speech, maybe. And one day I realized I have much more to say on this subject. But it's not print. It's not as though like it's, you know, we're going to run out of paper. It's not like a newspaper. That actually, it's, again, the freedom of the internet, where you can, I think one of them is 2,500 words, which is really the size of a short story, and a long short story. So that was the first freedom. The second freedom was to move from autobiographical material to commentary on literary texts, to try and keep the thing literary. You know, a lot of people's blogs are about their opinions about what's going on now, but literature is meant to be news that stays news. So the idea of the blog was to try and reflect that by writing about things such as Joyce, you know, such as back-reading Ulysses, thinking about Thomas Kinsler, thinking about Anthony Cronin, thinking about Ivan Boland, thinking about those writers who had known, who had died, whose work remained. And just, so it was a lovely thing to do every month. And then the deadlines, I was great for the first 2 years. And then I started to miss the deadlines. And I would think for a whole month, I would be about to write my blog. And I would stay at home, oh I have to write my blog. And it's like washing your hair or something when you have hair, you know, oh my God, I have to wash my hair. And then another week would go by, then eventually I would sit down and do it. But it's on the website. It's, you know, it's free of charge, and I think it amounts to, something like 60 or 70,000 words at this point. So it's funny. It's also a lesson to everybody that if you did that every month, write say 1,500 words, just write 1,500 words every month. After 3 years, oddly enough, with the way these things go, you have 50,000 words. That's a book. So don't let anyone tell you don't have time to write a book, because in 3 years you can just do it like that. I went to the universities to do, I suppose, what are called craft talks, meaning talk to students who are studying creative writing and hoping, you know, thinking about it as a profession. So we went to Maynooth, we went to UCD, we went to UCC, we went to the University of Limerick, and my aim really was to dismantle the idea that there is such a thing as craft. Because if you say there's craft over here and there's writing over there, and you have to learn craft before you write, well, that's nonsense. If you look at a story like The Dead by James Joyce, there's very little craft in it because it opens with Lily, the caretaker's daughter, was literally run off her feet. Well, she wasn't literally, but that's someone talking. But by the end of the story, it's not. It's a highly wrought literary tone. So any craft teacher, well, you can't do that in the story. Seamlessness is sort of necessary, seamlessness of tone. So I would just sit around saying, the first thing you say is, no such thing as craft. Don't believe them. If they're telling you about craft, don't believe them. Just write your story and see where it takes you. I suppose what I'm saying is that if you try and professionalize writing, that seems too much to me. I mean, I think that if you're in a workshop for a year or two in a university, your job is to finish your book, and often gives you deadlines and gives you a community of readers who are working with you. But the idea that there's something known as craft, like an electrician does have to know a great deal before you can really work with plugs. But a writer, in a way, everyone writes, everyone lives in language. So it's just a question of trying to refine that. But it's a vocation rather than a profession. It's like being a priest. For the 3 years, I did a lecture every year. And one of the great things was that they could be free. So the first one was in Galway, it was in the town hall, and it was free. And what I wanted the three things to do was the first one to be about music, and the second one to be about poetry, and the third one to be about visual arts. It was the three things that the Laureate for fiction should not be engaged with. But that's not the way it works. And I think any writer knows that people's relationship to certain music or to paintings or to poetry. And so the first one was amazing because I was able to talk about traditional musicians and singers whose work I had known, such as Iarla Linard, such as Myriad and Trina Ní Dhomhnaill, but also to talk about a string quartet, a sort of half-forgotten string quartet. And then, lo and behold, onto the stage came the three people I've mentioned, the three singers, and lo and behold, onto the stage came a quartet to play the last movement of Frederick May's string quartet. And this is in the town hall in Galway, and it's lovely because it takes the pressure off you. You feel, your first question with a lecture is this lecture boring? Because lectures, by definition, are sort of boring. People just wander, their minds wander off as you drone on, and it's really bad in a big theatre. Like, it's for actors, musicians, it's not for you on a podium, droning on from your notes and telling the audience further things about yourself. So the music simply lifted that pressure from me. And the other thing we did, which was in the Seamus Heaney, in the home place in County Derry, which was to actually bring an actress, Kathy Belton, and then Martin Hayes. So it was about the underworld, the poetry of the underworld, which of course Seamus Heaney had written and Ivan Boland had written, and then to use various other poems. And the third one then was to be about visual art. And I'm passionate about the idea that something like the Arts Council collection, which really is over 60 years of the Arts Council, will go to an exhibition, usually by a young artist, and half as a way of supporting the artist or just getting things going, actually by a painting. The problem is, over 60 years, some of those artists became well known and some didn't. But the problem is the work remains in the collection. What do you do with that? And what I want to do is look at everything and try and find work that mightn't be by the painters who have become the famous ones, such as Louis Le Brocq or Patrick Collins or Camille Souter. See if there's other work that really stands up now, after 50 years, after 40 years. Some of it has been in the store since then. And just to see what you could do if you put together, say, 20 strong pieces. And what I just found that there was an interesting, among the collection of abstract paintings that use one or two colours. So what an interesting idea, because you don't associate that with Ireland at all. You think about Ireland as big expressionist paintings or paintings of the landscape. But these were very pure, and they were sort of where a lot of Irish painters had looked to France or looked to America. And putting that together and then giving a talk about how this work had mattered, it mattered to me, and I thought it was important. So I got to do the 3 lectures as well, which was great. The word laureate is great because we think of the poet laureates in England over all the years, people like Ted Hughes. And in Ireland, of course, it's really worked with people like Paul Durcan and John Montague and Nuala Ní Dhomhnaill as the poet laureate. I think in the Arts Council, it was a project really by Pat Moylan, who was the chair of the council, who thought, well, since we have a poet laureate, since we have a children's writers laureate, is there any reason why we shouldn't have a fiction laureate? I think it was very much Pat Moylan's idea. We certainly should remember that, because it was, it was something that I think it was an idea for her, that is there one thing as chair I could do that isn't just about policy and strategy, that isn't about funding large organizations, is something new and bright and brilliant. And so she came up with this idea. It just means, I think eventually every county is going to have one. In America, the word laureate didn't exist until about 20 years ago. And then it's become, everyone's now the laureate for something in America. Every county, every state. It used to be called the advisor on poetry to the Library of Congress was the title. But now it's become the poet laureate. It's a lovely new title in America. But it just means, I think it's what Anne Enright said at the very beginning. She was the first laureate, that it's an honor and it's a job. And I think if you take it like that and forget the honor part, that's not your business. The job part then, and seeing what you can do. I think when you get older, and I'm going to be 70, that you don't have what you did have, which is a community of young writers, when you were a young writer, all of whom are publishing first stories, publishing first books, and the excitement around that. I see that in the city. I see it in somewhere like the group of writers around the Stinging Fly magazine. I see it even in a younger generation. The other night I was somewhere and these three, I thought, children came in, all of whom are having their first novels out next year. I thought it funny the way the three of them were so easy in the Dublin, in the Ireland they live in, where they had a community. But I think as you get older, you don't have that as much. I mean, you have your friends, your family, but you don't have that same sense of 10 writers starting off. And so it reconnected me in a way with the excitement. I mean, we saw people with their first books. I mean, there was an amazing episode we did in Cork in the library with Nisha Dolan. And just watching Nisha, I'd never met her before. I remember turning up to meet her in some hotel lobby and wondering what she would be like on the stage, because she seemed sort of shy. And then the minute the microphone was on, she was, without changing or doing anything special, she became really engaging and engaged by the audience. And this was with her first book. So it was such a pleasure to meet her, such a pleasure to be around. There's a funny energy around people who are about to publish a first book. I mean, it's not like having a baby. People keep talking about, oh, your book must be like having a baby. It's not like having a baby. But that there is an excitement around. Alan Murren was another example of a writer where he had a first book out, and there was a sense too that he'd been, I suppose it's like a thermometer or a stethoscope up to the heartbeat of his own world in Donegal, and it was new what he was doing, and again, just tapping into that for me just gave me contact with the source of energy that when you're 70, you don't necessarily have as much as you did when you were 25.